So let's get going for Monarch Mondays. It's just me today. Doing a little bit of history about Edward the First. Now, Edward the First, let me show you a little picture of Edward the First. Mandy, for your birthday, we've picked one of the best looking kings. Check out this chap right here. Oh my goodness, what a stunner. What a stunner he is. We heard last week with Richard, we heard about his father, Henry III. We heard all about him being a little bit of, well, you know, a bit of a weakling, really, quite pious, quite sort of monkfish, really. He was, Edward, in comparison, is very, very different. He's strong, he's brave, he's quite tall as well. He is 6 feet 2 inches tall, which now is still fairly tall, but back then was particularly so. He was a very impressive presence. He was very, very tall, very strong, quite a fiery temper. He could be quite crabby as well. So he's somebody who, you know, is quite sort of, well, impressive as a king, really. There is a story as well that there was a man who just was in the presence of the king and he found him so utterly terrifying that he died of sheer fright. So that gives you a bit of a sense of Edward. Now, he was known, there's a couple of names he's known by. One is Edward Longshanks. Longshanks meaning long legs, so very tall. And the hammer of the Scots, which we're going to come to in a little bit, because that is one thing he's very famous for, is going up to Scotland and beating 7 bells out of them. Now, as you know, he's named Edward. It's fairly obvious. And his father, Henry III, this pious guy, named him after Edward the Confessor. We heard a little bit about that last week from Richard, how he buried Edward the Confessor at the heart of Westminster Abbey as a saint. And so as a result, he named his son after this ex-king and also very, very pious man. It was so important back then for people to be religious and pious. You were constantly looking to God. You were also, you know, you're really worried about what's going to happen to your soul as well. So people are very, very pious, very, very religious. And actually, Edward's not quite so religious as his father was. He's more fighty. He's more kind of going out there and you know, starting a bit of a scrap. Very early on, when he was only 15 years of age, he was married to his wife, Eleanor of Castile, who was 12 at the time. Now, this sounds really shocking to us now, but back then that was kind of, well, I've heard some reports she might have been 9, but somewhere between sort of 9 and 12, so pretty young. But they are married until she dies. It's actually quite a good match, and they have quite a few kids together. Now, we heard a little bit last week about how he was taken hostage under Simon de Montfort, who started the basis for the new government. I'm not going to go too much back into that today, but I'm going to start at the bit where he goes off on crusades. Now, we heard about Richard the Lionheart a few weeks ago going off on crusade and, you know, actually sort of doing okay, sort of it being a bit rubbish, but Edward goes on one crusade. Now, he's this sort of naturally very fighty king with lots of military ability, so he goes off on crusade while his father is still on the throne, so he's still a prince at this point. Now, in order to do this, he needed a lot of money, and Parliament agreed a levy of 1/20th of every citizen's goods and possessions in order to finance this crusade. It's a huge amount of money that he's taking, and he's one of the last kings to go on crusade for the original sort of purpose of the recovery of the Holy Lands. The popes do a little bit of crusading as well. They carry on doing some, but it's more kind of for political gains. But Edward heads off with the King of France, Louis IX, to go off on crusade. But Louis IX dies before Edward even gets there. So when he turns up, he's got about 1,000 troops. It's quite a small amount of troops, really, and he doesn't really achieve that much. So he kind of flounders around a little bit. And in the end, all he achieves is a truce. And he stays over there for a bit, but there's an assassination attempt on his life. So he comes back to England and never goes on crusade again. And then shortly after, his father dies. Now, at this point, Edward, we've chatted a little bit in the last few weeks about how succession is always a little bit of a tricky thing, because some people agree, some people don't. Other people come in and say, oh, I've got a claim. But with Edward, because he'd sort of proved himself with his military ability, particularly in the Crusades and other things, everyone just goes, yeah, fine, you're in. So as the oldest son of Henry III, he comes in and he becomes king. So, like I say, he's not sort of as devout, not quite as pious as his father, but he is one of the things he's very interested in is asserting the right of English kings in the British Isles. Even whether or not they had any rights, that was what he wanted to assert. And for him, it was a sort of, he was chasing after peace, really, which seems odd now because you'll sort of hear the kind of things that he did. But he was determined to sort of group everything together under his leadership. And he starts out with Wales. Now, Wales is divided up into sort of princedoms. And there's a kind of system, a sort of feudal baronial system called the Marcher Lords, which is not particularly popular in Wales. It was set up by the Normans, basically, to kind of give precedence for kind of an English system over the Welsh. And there's a very uneasy alliance with this feudal system and the southern Welsh princes. But the northern Welsh princes really are not. They are totally not in on this deal at all. And there's a chap called Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, who is kind of challenging all of this, and he starts setting about, challenging Edward and fighting Edward. He refuses to attend Edward's coronation, which really peeves the king. He refuses to do homage to him as well, and he sort of, waves this red flag in front of Edward. And so as a result, Edward basically thinks, well, I'm going to have to go and sort of tell him who's boss. And he does. He goes down to Wales and he starts a series of battles against Llewellyn and against his brother, David. And it's kind of going back and forth. Now, Henry III, we heard, was not a particularly brilliant fighter. He was a bit rubbish, but Edward is much, much better. So he goes down and he's having an awful lot of success in these battles. But then Llewellyn is killed in a chance battle in 1282. And this kind of leaves the space open for Edward to sort of do what he wants, really. Llewellyn's brother, David, is still around, but not, is kind of a bit set back by the whole thing and has to sort of sit and think and go, oh my goodness. And Edward sort of sweeps in and brings Wales under England's control. And in 1301, he makes his own son, also called Edward, who we'll hear about more next week. He names him as the Prince of Wales, the first English Prince of Wales there's ever been. Now, I'm sure you know now, Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, good old Chuck. He is the current Prince of Wales. It's now a title that belongs to usually the heir to the throne. And that's gone on since 1301. So the first English Prince of Wales is back then. And what Edward does is he sets up, now I actually haven't shown you any pictures of anyone, have I? Because I always forget to do this. Right, firstly, this is his wife. This is Eleanor of Castile, who we'll hear more about in a minute. This is Llewellyn ap Gruffydd. Now, this is obviously not him. This is a statue of him, but it's quite amazing. I think he looks a little bit like a kind of a Death Eater, but nonetheless. But this is in Wales. And what Edward does is he sets up a ring of castles called the Ring of Iron. There's about 10 castles in total. Costs him a huge amount of money, about £80,000. And he sets up all these castles in order to kind of subjugate the Welsh and to form a barrier against the Welsh kind of trying to come and fight the English. This is Conwy Castle in Wales. It's absolutely beautiful. Mostly in ruins now. Some are in ruins, some are still kind of full castles. If you ever go down there, I love Wales, and the castles are absolutely beautiful. So do go and have a little look as and when we can. There's quite a lot of support for his campaign in England. It's a sort of seen as his determination to get peace. So the English are pretty, behind all this, as we tend to be. We like to kind of, stick one in the guts to people and go, oh, isn't that good? But what happens in the middle of all of this is something slightly awful happens. His wife, Eleanor, dies. Now, he has sort of finished his Welsh campaign and he's starting to focus on Scotland, and he's up in the north and he says to her, look, why don't you come up to join me up here? And so she does. So she starts to head north to go and see him, but she falls ill en route. And he was so devastated when she died that there were sort of stories that said that, he loved her, but then when she died, he was suddenly like, oh, I hadn't quite realised how much I loved you and depended on you. So when she died, they had a little route through England. She was kind of around Nottingham area. They brought her body back to London to be buried in Westminster Abbey. And every single place that her body rested for the night, it took 11 nights, they erected a cross, the Eleanor cross. And you can see these are all the crosses throughout England. The red ones are the ones that still exist. The others are either they don't exist anymore, or we have a sort of modernised version of them. This is one, which is a kind of thing, Victorian reimagining of one. And there's one in London, not an original one, at Charing Cross, as you might notice this if you know London, in front of Charing Cross Station. And there is a thought that Charing Cross actually comes from this cross being there. They think it comes from the French chère reine, meaning darling queen. So the cross, it wasn't actually a cross, it was a sort of a pillar, if you like, but it was called a cross, and so the cross of the darling queen. We're not 100% sure if that is true, but there's theory that that's where the names comes from. And she was buried in Westminster Abbey, and I have a picture of her too. Well, actually a drawing of her tomb right here. It's one of my favourite tombs in the Abbey, actually. It's kind of covered in this amazing sort of black filigree metalwork. It's just beautiful. And hilariously, her husband, Edward, is also buried there, but on the other side of Edward's father, Henry III, who built Westminster Abbey. He's kind of playing piggy in the middle. So you've got Eleanor here, Henry next to her, and then Edward round the side, which I just think is hilarious. Nothing like a father to, you know, interrupt marital fun, let's say. So that is Eleanor. So that's the end of her, and he kind of, you know, he's quite thrown by this because they were a very good team, and he does end up getting married again. In total, throughout his life, he has 17 children. Pretty impressive. Now, in order to raise money for all of these battles that he wants to do, and in particular there's a battle against the French king, when Edward got married for the first time, his father, and I love this is a brilliant thing, he just gave him a chunk of land in France, Gascony, as a wedding present. Here you go, have part of a country. Now at one point the French king is challenging this, he's trying to sort of fight back and try and get Gascony back from Edward, and so Edward needs to kind of go and fight him for that. And he has to sort of raise a load of taxes in order to do this. Now, he learnt very early on the lessons from his father and from King John. We heard about the fact that King John used to skate all over the population just to kind of get the money that he wanted, take the taxes and do whatever he needed, really. And so Edward decides, well, I'm not just going to ride roughshod over them. What I am going to do is I'm going to actually do this in conjunction with the Parliament. And Parliament was then sitting sort of twice a year. And so he starts bringing them in more regularly. And they say, yep, we can levy the taxes to go and do this. So he gets a load of money together. Now, this Parliament that he raises is called the Model Parliament. This is kind of the first example that we see of a Parliament that really represents a whole variety of different people. Now, we're still not talking about, you know, the people sort of shoveling dirt at the bottom of the field, but we are talking about barons, clergy, knights, and there are some townspeople involved in that as well. And so by the end of Edward's reign, Parliament is starting to become somewhere that does actually represent different areas and different types of people around the country. So the amount of sort of groundwork that was put in by the Magna Carta, by Simon de Montfort that we heard about last week, and then by Edward I really sets the basis for the kind of Parliament and local government that we've then seen extrapolated through to today. But going back to Scotland, now this is where Edward gets his name, the Hammer of the Scots. In 1290 rather, Edward is recognised as an overlord of Scotland. And the reason is because there has been a bit of a succession, or an argument really. I've already mentioned that, you know, succession is a tricky thing at the best of times, but there's an argument over succession in Scotland. And so Edward is called in to kind of, you know, adjudicate on this. And he decides to rule in favour of a chap called John Balliol. And this is John Balliol right here, another pious looking man. Very, very, you know, dedicated to God completely. And so John Balliol comes in, but Edward kind of treats him like a bit of a puppet. He is the one who is doing, you know, he's kind of telling him what he should be doing. And this doesn't go down particularly well. And Balliol actually ends up rejecting him and rebelling. So Edward doesn't take this lying down. He puts him in the Tower of London, which is rather fun. And he then, because he's done this, faces huge amounts of rebellion all over Scotland. One of these is the rebellion by William Wallace. Now, this is Mel Gibson in Braveheart, if you've ever seen the film. Should have had a picture of him, shouldn't I, really? But anyway, William Wallace, this sort of a champion of Scottish independence, and he picks up this mantle of Scottish sort of identity and the need to be free from the clutches of the English kings, and he starts, you know, fighting Edward across the place. Now, one thing that Edward has done in order to really subjugate the Scots is he takes a stone. Now, this right here is the coronation chair. This is in Westminster Abbey, and you can see that there's a stone at the bottom. And this stone was stolen. It's called the Stone of Scone, or the Stone of Destiny, which I think always sounds really magical. And it was stolen from Scotland by Edward in 1299. And the aim was, that was the stone on which every Scottish king had been crowned, or anointed if we're going to be particular about it. And so he stole it. And he had this chair made to encompass it, so that any future king of England would be crowned on the English throne and the Stone of Scotland, to let them know who was boss. And it was down in London until 1996. It's now up in Edinburgh again. So all of these things are coming together to really, you know, not make England and the king particularly favourable in Scotland. So William Wallace is fighting against all of this, and he ends up being captured, handed over to the king, and the king takes him down to England and has him summarily executed by hanging, drawing and quartering at a place called Smithfield. Now in Smithfield today there is still a plaque to William Wallace, and there are often Scottish flags and things that are left there as well. So it is a kind of place of pilgrimage, and he was then buried in an unmarked grave, as you might imagine. For somebody who, you know, was so sort of anti the king, you're not going to bury him in a marked grave, because that's going to incite people to kind of come and rally around. Now, after this, so William Wallace is executed in 1305, and 1306, a man called Robert the Bruce, who's a wonderful statue of him here with a great little headband on, he takes up the cause of Scottish independence, and he is crowned as the King of Scotland at Scone, without the stone, but nonetheless. Now, Edward is furious at hearing this. He's just, you know, executed William Wallace. He thought his troubles were over. Robert the Bruce has gone, nope, I'm coming on in to take over that manor. And so Edward thinks, well, I'm not going to take this lying down. And he goes up to Scotland. But he's not, you know, he's in his late 60s by this point. He is sound of mind, but not particularly physically sound anymore. So he heads up towards Carlisle, and he says to his army, you know, let's all sort of get together, rally at Carlisle, and what we're going to do is we're going to go into battle. But when he gets up there, he's so kind of weak that he can't even ride his horse. So he's taken in, being carried in, and he's then sets up camp in a priory near there, and kind of oversees everything. The battle's going on and he's not really into it. And then he hears of something, and he hears of a prophecy from Merlin, this famous wizard. Merlin has a prophecy saying that the death of prophecy that's happened long before, but that after his death, that the Welsh and the Scots are going to get together and essentially set the rules and do whatever they want. And he thinks, I'm not going to have that. So he gets on his horse and he starts riding towards the battle, and he's so unwell that they can't ride more than a couple of miles a day, and then they have to keep stopping, and he never actually gets there. He gets very close. He gets on the outskirts of where they're aiming for, and he has to just take to his bed. He's far too ill. And on one day in July, his servants go in to feed him lunch, and they sit him up to eat lunch, and he dies in their arms. He was suffering really badly with dysentery, and the game is over. Now, Robert the Bruce, when he's gone into battle against the English forces are very, very strong, and they're winning. And Robert the Bruce takes off. Now, he will come back. He does come back after Edward has died, and that is in the reign of Edward's son, Edward II. Now, Edward had this very kind of weak father as a king, not a great fighter, and his son is very, very similar. In fact, he's fallen out with his son just before he died. His son had a favourite who was a gentleman, and he was slightly more favourite than the king wanted him to be. We'll come on to more of that next week, but he had this massive row with him, pulled his hair apparently and screamed at him and all this sort of thing, and they fell out. But when he knew he was dying, he sent a message to his son Edward to say, when I die, take my body, boil me down and put my remains in a casket that you can have at the top of a lance, and have me at the front of any battle that you go into against Scotland in the future. Now, that didn't happen. He was buried here in Westminster Abbey in this very kind of unexciting tomb, and that is where he still is today. So they didn't take his body out, didn't boil it down, and he doesn't go back into battle against the Scots. He wanted to be leading his forces back into any battle, but that's just not the case. So he is here in Westminster Abbey. If you were to go to the left of this image, you get to Henry III, and then round the corner a bit further, you get to his wife, who we spoke about earlier. So Eleanor and Edward in Westminster Abbey. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. We're going to come back to the story next Monday for Monarch Mondays. We are going to come and talk about Edward II. My colleague Richard Ing will be back as well, so that'll be really fun. I like having Richard on as a guest. I think you'd agree, these stories are, you know, there's a lot of stuff that goes on with these kings and queens. They're pretty, you know, kind of skullduggery and all that kind of thing. Now, a great spot to mention that this, so I did my Harry Potter tour yesterday. We had 60 people on. It went really well. It was so much fun. And this Sunday coming, I'm going to do another public tour on Westminster Abbey. So if you want to hear more about the coronation throne, about Edward I, Henry III, Eleanor, we're going to do a tour on Sunday. It'll be £10 a head. And it's open for booking now on my website. So come and have a little look. I will see you all tomorrow at 3 o'clock, where we're going to be talking food, glorious food, with my lovely colleague David Drury. I will see you then. Have fun, stay safe, and see you at 3 tomorrow. Bye.